Good day. Today is Thursday, 1st May 2025. By the way, the holiday, it's a day of holiday in Russia and in many other countries around the world. To anybody who is enjoying or celebrating a holiday today, well, I wish you the best on this holiday. Anyway, today is also the day when we continue to have all sorts of things going on in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, but no sign of negotiations to end the conflict, obviously no sign of any kind of ceasefire. Nothing of that kind seems to be under discussion or serious discussion, and in fact, everything seems to have reached an impasse. In my opinion, we're not at an impasse. We're at the point where it's perhaps more realistic to say that the peace initiative that President Trump launched in February, after he became president, that peace initiative has essentially failed. The Ukrainians agreed a ceasefire, or appeared to agree a ceasefire, but are not interested, as far as I can see, in substantive negotiations with the Russians, and the Russians say that there cannot be a ceasefire unless there are substantive negotiations, with both Russia and Ukraine each rejecting the American proposals, the revised and tweaked Kellogg plan. So I am not going to discuss the negotiations further in this program because, as far as I can see, there are none. And it seems to me that, once again, it's clear that we are going to be in a time of conflict, at least until the autumn, when I suspect that further Russian advances might just possibly start a new process, either of negotiations or of escalation. In the meantime, what we have got is an agreement by the United States and Ukraine to what many people are still calling the minerals deal. Others are calling it the natural resources deal. Well, I've read the text of what purports to be this agreement. In fact, no doubt it is this agreement. I've read the text of this agreement, which has been published by various Ukrainian government agencies and which has also been published in the Ukrainian media. And I'm going to say straight away that, as far as I can see, it is not in any respect a minerals extraction deal. It can be described loosely as a deal to develop Ukrainian natural resources. But as far as I can see, the best way to describe this agreement is as an investment deal. In other words, the creation of an investment vehicle whereby the United States and Ukraine jointly develop the natural resources which are supposed to exist on Ukrainian territory to the benefit of both parties. So it's significantly different from the agreement that was discussed before. Now, I need to be careful because it looks as if this is one document amongst three, and only that one document has actually been signed. Yesterday, there was lots of discussion that the agreement was about to fall apart because the Ukrainians were refusing to sign the other two alongside the one that they did sign. The Americans supposedly told the Ukrainians that if they weren't prepared to sign all three documents at one and the same time, then they might as well go back to Ukraine. As far as I can see, only one document was in fact signed, and the Ukrainians in effect won the point. They've only signed one document. I have not seen any sign of the other three. And until and unless all three documents are produced, after presumably they have been signed, only then will we get a clearer picture of what it is exactly that has been agreed. But this is my own understanding of this agreement. Firstly, an investment fund, and I think the right word is investment fund, is being created. This investments fund will be owned 50-50 by the United States and by Ukraine. The investment fund will invest in the Ukrainian economy. The primary focus of this investment will be in Ukraine's natural resources sector. The proceeds of this investment, the profits of this investment, will then be divided equally between the United States and Ukraine, except that for the first 10 years of the operation of this agreement, all money, all profits made by this fund will remain in Ukraine. Now, I'd previously thought that this deal, this agreement, was intended to be limited to 10 years. It appears that it is in fact indefinite. But the key thing to say is, again, that in the first 10 years of its operation, from what I can understand, all profits made as a result of the work of this investment fund is going to remain in Ukraine. Now, that is a completely different agreement from the agreement we've been hearing about before. It does not in any way seek to recoup any of the money that the United States has invested in Ukraine. The $100 billion that Donald Trump says, or rather US officials have said, was provided by the United States in aid to Ukraine, or the $350 billion that Donald Trump continues to insist was provided in aid to Ukraine. There's no reference or word about that in any of this document. It has been suggested in various media outlets that the proceeds of the fund, the investment fund, the investments that this fund organizes, could be used by Ukraine to buy arms in the United States. Well, that perhaps is possible. That doesn't seem to be the main purpose of the fund, of this maybe investment vehicle would be a more correct word. But I'm not saying that that is not at least a possibility. Certainly, in no section of this agreement are there any security guarantees provided by the United States to Ukraine. When Zelensky first floated the idea of a minerals deal, he couched it clearly as an attempt to persuade the United States to provide arms to Ukraine, essentially on credit, with profits taken from the development of Ukraine's minerals, its natural resources, and with security guarantee provisions. In fact, part of the reason for the row in the Oval Office back in February was Zelensky's fury that he had not been able to extract a security guarantee from the United States in return for the mineral rights extraction deal, or at least the memorandum to agree to that, which was circulating up to that time. And, well, I would also say that there's been some excited commentary in parts of the British media that supposedly the agreement blames Russia for the war. Well, it does so, but in very, very pale terms. It talks about Russia's all-out invasion. It doesn't, however, make any stronger criticism. It doesn't speak of Russian aggression or anything of that kind. In fact, criticism in the agreement of Russia is very muted And from what I can remember, these words that now appear in this agreement concerning Russia's all-out invasion are in fact one of the few things that have been carried over from earlier drafts. So, an investment vehicle whereby the United States will invest in the Ukrainian economy. Ukraine will also invest in the Ukrainian economy. Ukraine will get half the proceeds. The United States will get half the proceeds. But in the first 10 years, all of the proceeds will remain in Ukraine. Looked at purely as a commercial transaction, this agreement, unlike the previous agreements, seems to me to be strongly beneficial to Ukraine. The previous agreements were lopsided and massively extractive in the United States' favour. This agreement, on the contrary, appears to create a vehicle for US investment in Ukraine and on far from extortionate terms, at least where Ukraine is concerned. Now, saying all of this, one wonders whether Donald Trump fully is aware of the nature of the agreement that his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, has signed on his behalf, signed with the Ukrainian economics minister, by the way. Because as of yesterday, he was still talking about how this agreement was eventually going to get back for the United States the entire $350 billion that it had, in effect, given to Ukraine. Well, I don't see that at all. A investment vehicle in which, from what I can see, the United States is going to be putting investment funding into is hardly a mechanism to recover those $350 billion that Donald Trump is talking about. Perhaps over time, if this agreement were ever implemented, perhaps over time, it might eventually produce profits for the United States that amount to $350 billion. But that probably would be a very long time indeed. Certainly not 1 or 10 or 5 or whatever it is years. We're talking about a very, very long period of time, far beyond his presidency. In fact, as I said, what this agreement looks to me like is an agreement more to prop up Ukraine's economy than anything else. Now, the point is that none of this can actually happen unless there is a peace agreement, a general peace in Ukraine, because one can set up these investment vehicles and we don't yet have a clear understanding, at least I don't get from this document, this one document that I've seen, a clear understanding of exactly what it will be that this investment vehicle is going to be investing in. One assumes it is going to be natural resources, gas and such things, but might be possibly other things. But I cannot see how this investment vehicle can work unless and until there is peace. And that is as far away as ever. So in that respect, this document is a meaningless, pointless scrap of paper that cannot make or take us anywhere very far. But this must be said, in the battle of wills between Vladimir Zelensky and Donald Trump, which has produced this agreement, it seems to be absolutely clear, incredible though it appears, that Vladimir Zelensky has turned out the winner. He may not have got the security guarantee from the United States that he was looking for. he might not have obtained an agreement that actually does provide funding for future arms purchases from the United States. It seems that, as I said, I find this difficult to reconcile, this idea difficult to reconcile with the agreement that I have seen. But as I said, there are other documents behind it which might provide clarity on that point. The fact remains that we started with an agreement that was massively lopsided in favor of the United States, and we have ended up with an agreement that is undoubtedly beneficial to Ukraine. Now, again, one does wonder exactly how that happened, and whether Donald Trump fully understands that this is what has actually taken place. Now, Donald Trump impresses me as one of these people who's perhaps not hugely interested in the details of things, and it could be that he delegated a lot of the work on this agreement to his Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. But I still find it very difficult to believe that Donald Trump is actually ignorant of the outlines of the agreement that was reached, of the nature of the agreement that was reached. Also note that, as I said, it seems as if only this agreement, not the other two, was signed, and that also is consistent with Zelensky getting his way. Apparently he wants to renegotiate parts of those agreements also. The Americans said take it or leave it, but the Americans backed down on that. So I can't help but feel that it looks to me as if Donald Trump has come under significant pressure and has acceded to that pressure, and is now starting and has been perhaps doing so for some time, to move more onto Ukraine's side in terms of this conflict. Of course, he still makes critical comments about Ukraine, as did Mike Waltz, his national security advisor. Mike Waltz, for example, is saying that Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, which happens, by the way, to be true. But why, in that case, create an investment fund to invest in that country's economy and agree to a provision that for the first 10 years, all the money from that fund will remain in Ukraine? Surely that is a mechanism that all but ensures that the United States will never see much of this money. Just saying, if you really believe Ukraine to be the most corrupt country, or one of the most corrupt countries in Europe and perhaps the world. So I suspect what has happened is that Donald Trump, having back in February embarked on his great process of trying to agree to end the conflict in Ukraine, he spoke about doing it within 1 day, 24 hours, but then he set himself apparently an artificial deadline. April, Easter originally, 20th of April, we were told that was by then that he was expecting to get the ceasefire. He didn't get the ceasefire by Easter. He then apparently hoped to get the ceasefire, or at least some kind of movement, within the first 100 days. The 100 days of his presidency have come and gone, and perhaps under a great deal of pressure from his officials and from his advisors, from Kellogg, from Bessent, from all sorts of people, and needing to show that he's at least getting something back, he's agreed to this agreement, in effect agreeing to pretty much, well, to many of the demands, a great many of the demands that Zelensky has made. In my opinion, Donald Trump now is on a slide. Way back in the summer of 2024, I think it's fair to say before anyone else, Alex Christoforou and I said that the thing that Donald Trump needed to do was, when he became president, to say straightforwardly that this was not his war, that this was Joe Biden's war, that he thinks that further involvement in the war is contrary to the interests of the United States, and that the United States was therefore coming to the end of its involvement. It would no longer be involved further in the war as it had been previously, and that from this point onwards it would be for the Ukrainians and for the Europeans to sort it out. He didn't do that. Instead, he went with his peace plan that was proposed to him back in April of last year by General Kellogg, apparently assuming that the Russians would agree. He found that the Russians didn't agree. He asked for a ceasefire. He sought a ceasefire, to which the Russians also didn't agree. He found that his attempts to achieve peace were running into enormous opposition from Europe and indeed from Zelensky himself. And so, in order to say that he's achieved at least something, he needed this agreement, and that's what he's come up with. But of course, by making this agreement, as Eve Smith, by the way, warned in a series of articles she wrote for Naked Capitalism, I remember back in, I think it was January, by making this agreement, Donald Trump has actually tied the United States closer, if anything, to Ukraine. And he's recently been talking about further sanctions on Russia in order to try to get the Russians to come round to a ceasefire. The Russians will not be impressed by those sanctions, and those sanctions will not force them to agree to a ceasefire, even if the sanctions take the bone-crushing form that Lindsey Graham is talking about. And, well, if he does that, if he imposes sanctions on the Russians and they still don't agree to his ceasefire, if he goes and starts seizing Russian ships on the high seas, or tries to do something like that, but that doesn't work either, and if the Russian army continues advancing, then perhaps in 6 months' time, when apparently, according to the London Times, Ukraine's weapons stockpile will finally be exhausted, maybe at that point he will find that the pressure to resume arms deliveries to Ukraine on a large scale has become overwhelming, and just as he's backed down over what was the mineral rights extraction deal, but has now become, as I said, some kind of investment fund, so he will back down on that also. At which point, he will be Joe Biden. He will find himself exactly where he said he didn't want to be. He's constantly criticized what Joe Biden was doing. He has spoken out fiercely about Joe Biden's whole approach to the war, whole approach to Russia, but he will in effect be doing exactly the same things as Joe Biden has done. Now, there is a lot of discussion, especially in the Russian media, by the way, and as I understand it, on Russian Telegram and chat places, about the various types of pressures that might have been exerted on Donald Trump while he's gone down this route. Of course, there will be some people who will say that that was his intention always. But then, again, I ask the question, if that was always his intention, to end up providing Ukraine with weapons and financial support and all of that kind of thing. Why didn't he just go ahead and do that straight away, straight after his election? I mean, what prevented him from taking that course then? Difficult to see. But anyway, put that aside. There's been discussion on the Russian side of, the internet, if you like, as to who exactly it was who has ultimately pushed Donald Trump in this direction. And the common thread to many of these discussions, and I've had this also in private emails, by the way, is that one shouldn't really look so much to Keith Kellogg, who does have some influence, but not overwhelming influence, or Marco Rubio, but rather to Donald Trump's chief of staff, Susan Wiles. There's been much discussion that ultimately she's a mainstream Republican with many of the attitudes and opinions that mainstream Republicans have, including concerning Russia, that though she may be an extremely capable chief of staff, she's not somebody who is going to break with the establishment consensus, and that Donald Trump relies on her very heavily, and she is the person who has consistently argued in favor of Rubio and Kellogg and Waltz and the others, and ultimately Donald Trump isn't able to break with her and went along with her. I have no idea whether that is true or not. I'm not even interested, if I have to be honest, in the internal intrigues within the White House, which, as I said, are not my concern. But for the record, I just put that out. If people want to follow that up and follow up who it is who's influencing Donald Trump in any particular direction, well, that story, the pointing the finger at Susan Wiles, is out there on the Russian side of the internet. But anyway, we shall see what happens. This deal, as I said, this agreement cannot function unless there is peace, and of peace there is no sign. I still think that Trump is going to be very wary of going down the route of further sanctions, certainly the kind of sanctions that Lindsey Graham is talking about, because I think he understands the effect of sanctions like that on the global economy and specifically on the economy of the United States. He may also understand that by now sanctions like that are unworkable. But sanctions of his own he might impose. We will see whether he does that over the next couple of days or weeks, perhaps after over the next couple of days. Though my own view for the moment is that all of his various threats to walk away from Ukraine, they don't seem to be worth anything very much. We've seen that, on the contrary, he's just signed this agreement. So anyway, there we are. That's where the situation with Donald Trump, the United States and Ukraine currently is. A lot of noise and activity, 2 telephone conversations between Trump and Putin, various meetings between American and Russian officials in Istanbul, in Riyadh, lots of talk about getting the embassies restarted, lots of discussions about economic deals, but I suspect that in the end it is all going to amount to nothing. Now, the Russians, by the way, just to finish with all of this, have been making some commentary. There's been an interesting commentary in Izvestia, which also says that there is really no sign that negotiations are about to happen. It reads as follows: none of Russia's attempts to declare a ceasefire, these are the temporary ceasefires, the Easter ceasefire, the energy truce, the ceasefire over the May Victory Day holiday. None of Russia's attempts to declare a ceasefire have been supported by Ukraine, which indicates that the Kiev regime is betting on war, Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia Mikhail Galuzin has told Izvestia. The Russian Foreign Ministry emphasizes that Moscow has no contact with the Ukrainian side apart from coordination on prisoner exchanges. Russia remains open to dialogue with Ukraine without preconditions. And then we get quotes from Galuzin. Not a single attempt to declare a ceasefire has in practice been supported by the Kiev regime, which continues to violate the truce. This shows that the regime is staking everything on war. Moreover, Kiev's self-imposed legislative ban on negotiations with Russia remains in effect. That refers to Zelensky's October 2022 decree. There is no basis to suggest that Ukraine is ready to alter its actions on the ground in any way. We do not see this happening. All we observe is erratic, pseudo-peacekeeping rhetoric. Hollow declarations of peace are not enough. We do not see any indication that Ukraine is demonstrating or confirming a willingness to pursue a ceasefire. And then we had comments by Rodion Miroshnik, Russia's ambassador at large. At present, there is contact with Ukraine only on matters related to exchanges at the military level. There is also dialogue at the ombudsman level. There are no other official contacts, neither exploratory meetings nor negotiations about negotiations. The only efforts we see come from the Americans, who are attempting to act as mediators. And we're then told by a Russian expert, Tigran Melkonian, clearly an Armenian, but anyway, he's in Russia. It's highly likely that such negotiations could resume in 2025, only because Kiev is under considerable pressure from Washington and the international community to seek a diplomatic resolution. But that can only happen, I suspect, once the dynamics on the battlefield dictate that outcome. I doubt that there will be any further move towards negotiations over the course of the summer. On the contrary, we're likely to see further sanctions. Now, further sanctions on Russia by the United States and plausibly by the European Union. Of course, if Donald Trump goes all the way and supports Lindsey Graham's sanctions, then frankly, my own opinion is that at that point, there will be no negotiations at any time at all, and the outcome will be decided on the battlefield. Now, before I leave this and turn to the military situation, which, as I said, is now going to be the main driver of events, I want to come to an article that has appeared in the London Times. And by the way, it complements an article on the same topic that has appeared in the British magazine Unheard. Both say that Donald Trump's approach to the conflict in Ukraine is heavily informed and shaped by his memory of the war in Vietnam, which of course was raging in the 1960s, when he was in his 20s and when he avoided call-up in the military to fight in Vietnam on the grounds that there were various disabilities about which I'm not going to waste time on. But Unheard, the article in Unheard, suggested that Trump has always been haunted by the disaster that Vietnam was for the United States and by enormous divisions that Vietnam created within American society. And this has always made him determined that the United States, under his leadership, should not be plunged in a long war that it cannot win. But of course, the other side to it, which is set out in the article in the London Times, is that Trump is also haunted by memories of the fall of Saigon and by the fall of Kabul. For the record, we are now 50 years from the time when Saigon fell, a event which I remember very, very clearly. Just to say, I was there watching it all happen as a teenager from London. I remember all the pictures and all the film and all the hand-wringing and all the recriminations that took place then. Anyway, Donald Trump apparently is haunted by the fall of Saigon scenario and the fall of Kabul scenario, and is desperate to avoid a similar fall of Kiev taking place whilst he is president. Well, all I will say about that is that if Donald Trump really does want to prevent Kiev falling in the same kind of way that Saigon once fell and Kabul once fell, then the best thing he can do is to come to an agreement with Russia. Because if the war goes on indefinitely, then sooner or later, Russia will take Kiev. Trump himself alluded to this fact when he said that eventually, if peace is not achieved, the Russians will crush Ukraine. So he seems to understand that at some level. He points out how much more powerful Russia is than Ukraine. He returns to all these points time and time again, but he's not able, or so it seems, to follow the logic through and to do what his friend Steve Witkoff has told him. Witkoff, who has of course met Putin now no fewer than 4 times. He doesn't seem to be able to follow through and make the agreement with the Russians, which might actually be the one thing that prevents the fall of Saigon or situation with Kiev actually playing out. Now, there it is. That's where we are. I think we can forget about negotiations for the next few weeks and months. The Trump administration asked Congress to license the sale by the United States of $50 million worth of weapons to Ukraine. Some people are making a huge play out of that. As I understand it, these are weapons that Ukraine is paying for, or somebody is paying for on behalf of Ukraine up front. So it might be a symbolic thing, but it's still different from a situation where Donald Trump exercised his drawdown authority and started to transfer arms to Ukraine, or went to Congress to seek a further appropriation on behalf of Ukraine. We are nowhere close to that point yet, but as I said previously, if whatever sanctions he imposes don't succeed, if the Russians continue the advance, the pressure on him to do that will probably grow, and we will see what exactly he decides to do at that point. The London Times article, incidentally, also quoted a Ukrainian commentator who said, I think absolutely rightly, that at this precise moment in time, Donald Trump himself doesn't know what he is going to do. He doesn't know whether, if the point of crisis comes, he will authorize further arms transfers to Ukraine or not. Anyway, we shall see. Now let us today, now that we've, at least for the time being, put aside the talk about negotiations, and I want to emphasize again the current peace drive, it seems to me, has failed. Let us talk about the military situation in somewhat more detail than I've been doing in recent programs. Now, there's a number of things that need to be said very clearly. First of all, there's been a long article in the Wall Street Journal about the extent of the Russian military buildup. And it says that in the rear, the Russians are building up their forces, and that recruitment into the Russian army is now so high that the Russians are not only able to replace their battlefield losses on the territory of Ukraine itself, but are in a position to build up reserve armies in the rear. And they are establishing various bases and other things in places like, closer to Scandinavia than anywhere else. Large bases to house these big armies that they are creating, and that it is these reserve armies that are getting the pick of the enormous quantities of equipment that the Russian military industrial complex is now churning out. So we're told that Russia used to produce, prior to the start of the conflict, around 40 T-90M main battle tanks a year. Now that number has increased to 300. This year it's likely to increase still further. We've seen that the Russians have increased production of pretty much every other type of equipment as well. Enormous Russian forces are building up in Western Russia, northwestern Russia. 2 tank armies, has been said, and at the same time the Russians are able to replace their losses on the battlefronts. And there's also reports that what the Russians now routinely do is that they rotate their new formations onto the front, onto the contact line for certain periods of time in order to familiarize the soldiers and officers of these units with the reality of battle. So these units go onto the front line, they fight for a couple of weeks or months, then they're sent back to the rear where they continue the process of training and re-equipping and equipping and preparing for, well, what precisely? Now here there is an interesting debate, because Simplicius the thinker and another school of thought says that these huge armies that have been created in Russia are intended to deter NATO, that the Russians have been building up these forces inside Russia not with a view to launching them into the war in Ukraine itself. The current military force in Ukraine, which is about half the force, the size of these reserve armies that are being created in the rear, that that force is apparently seen as adequate for the purpose of grinding down Ukraine. It gets the forces on the contact line supposedly are getting less advanced equipment than the new reserve armies are getting. But anyway, supposedly these reserve forces are being held back in the rear for other contingencies. Now, I am going to say that I have a completely contrary view to this. I think it is most unlikely, given that we are involved in a war and that the main area of the war, the main conflict area, is indeed Ukraine, that these armies, these big reserve armies that are being built up, are not intended to play some role in this war eventually. They're being parked, no doubt, close to Scandinavia for the moment, because there have been various threats by NATO to conduct all kinds of operations there, the Baltic and all that. But I don't think that the Russians seriously believe that there is a threat to their national territory from NATO in the Baltic. And I think they've assessed the scale of the NATO forces in the area, and I think they've come to the conclusion that they're not anywhere near powerful enough to capture Kaliningrad, let alone St. Petersburg or any other place. And of course, were NATO to launch attacks on these places, they would be risking nuclear war. So I don't think that this is what this is about. I think these forces have been put out of the way in places which are more difficult for Ukrainian drones and missiles to reach, that they're being built up, probably training, equipping armies on this scale is a process that takes a great deal of time. I remember Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis telling me that prior to his brigade going into battle against the Iraqi army during the 1991 Kuwait war, his brigade needed around, I seem to remember, a year's training in order to fully hone its skills. So this is a long, protracted business. Especially when we're talking about armies, you've got to build up the headquarters, you've got to sort out the divisional headquarters, you have to get all the divisions, the new divisions operating and functioning properly. I think that this is probably what we've been seeing happen with these reserve armies. But eventually, as I said, when the breakdown comes on the front lines, as the Russians grind through the front lines, when the cascade effect comes, then it is likely that these reserve armies will finally be launched into the battle. And then that will be the moment, I suspect, when we know that the war is coming to an end. Now, I'm not going to make a prediction as to when this is going to happen, but I don't believe that if you are in a war, you build up huge forces in the rear and keep them there when you are in a perfectly good position to deploy them in the theatre of the war itself and win a decisive victory. So that, I think, is what is going on. But we do get a clear impression of the scale of what is coming from this article in the Wall Street Journal. And, well, there is, again, to make this also very clear, nothing comparable happening in the West. There is no military build-up of this size happening in the West. Rheinmetall, I believe, has a capacity to build around a dozen or perhaps a score of Leopard 2 tanks a year at the moment. I believe that in France, production of the Leclerc tank has ended, and I've heard no reports that it has been restarted. Britain, of course, has not restarted tank production, and its tank fleet is in a terrible condition. The United States does have large stockpiles of tanks and armoured vehicles, though I understand that the Bradley inventory has significantly reduced, but the United States is apparently planning to scale down its army rather than increase it because of budgetary pressures, and the Pentagon continues to be focused on a war against China. So this build-up by the Russians of their land forces must be the single thing that worries Western planners most, and logically it ought to worry the Ukrainians also. Now, there's been a great deal said about the situation on the battlefronts, and again, I'm now going to do a quick rundown of current events. Firstly, the Russians have apparently now entirely or almost entirely cleared Kursk region. There might be 1 or 2 kilometers, a few kilometers, square kilometers of territory in Kursk region that the Ukrainians nominally control. But the main battle in this part of the war is now happening on Ukrainian territory in Sumy region. And it's difficult to get, again, exact idea about what the Russians are planning to do long term whether they're only interested in creating a buffer zone. But it does seem that one of their medium-term objectives is to capture a village called Yunakovka, which lies on the way to the city of Sumy itself. Whether they plan to attack and capture Sumy itself is another matter. Now, the second area where things are moving, I think, significantly faster is in the Kharkiv area, where Group of Forces North is now, which Group of Forces North is now prioritizing. Now, this is a battle which has come to center very much around the town of Volchansk. From what I can gather, Volchansk is mostly now under Russian control. The Russians have started to conduct operations beyond Volchansk in various places, and there are suggestions that the Russians are also thinking or preparing to resume their offensive to capture the village of Lipsy. Now, Lipsy apparently lies on higher ground, and if it falls to the Russians, then they have the whole of Kharkiv, the city of Kharkiv, below them. I don't say that they're able to observe everything that happens in Kharkiv from Lipsy, but the Russians can track Kharkiv fairly well, and from Lipsy their artillery would be in a very strong position to shell Kharkiv. Now, Kharkiv, over the last couple of weeks, has been under very, very heavy drone and missile attack. And there have been many days when Kharkiv has been without electric power, and there are reports that large parts of the civilian population have fled. However, I've also obtained reports that the city, beneath the city, there is a large honeycomb of deep shelters, again created during the Soviet period, and there's uncertainty by the Russians as to what use the Ukrainians are making of them. I discussed the enormous build-up that the Russians are engaging in. I didn't discuss the fact that apparently production of the Oreshnik is now going full tilt. But apparently there have been discussions in Russia, I've heard this from private emails, about whether the Oreshnik might be used to attack bunkers under a city like Kharkiv. However, obviously there would be concerns because of the presence of the civilian population there. And I get the sense that the consensus is that rather than do that, the better policy would be to gradually move, if there is going to be an advance on Kharkiv, a move towards cutting off the supplies to Kharkiv and pushing the Ukrainians out of Kharkiv. Well, all of this is very tentative. Battles in the north. These places are closest, by the way, to the locations, the current locations of these two reserve armies. It could be that when the crisis, the military crisis for Ukraine eventually comes, it will be here in the north that these two reserve armies are deployed. And it could also be that it will be there in the north towards Kiev that the major blow will come. There are apparently military exercises being planned over the next couple of days close in Belarus by the Russian and Belarus militaries. There's some people in Ukraine who are apparently worried, including Zelensky himself, that this might be another preparation for another strike at Kiev. I think we're too early for that to happen. I doubt that this is the Russian plan now. Anyway, the main battle continues to be further south. And the Russians now seem to be in a strong position to break, or getting into a much stronger position to break Ukrainian resistance in Donbass. It looks as if in the Oskol and Zherebets river areas, the Russians are now close to launching an attack to recapture Liman, and of course Kupiansk as well. And it's been suggested that Liman is the gateway to advancing on Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, as Chasiv Yar also is. The Russians will be in a much stronger position if they capture Liman now, and than they were when they held Liman in 2022, because now they hold Bakhmut, Solidar, before long Siversk, and of course Chasiv Yar, where reports today suggest that the fighting is indeed about to end. There's been a report about it in TASS, and it's from our old friend Andrei Marochko. He says, as for Chasiv Yar, our forces have made serious achievements in the city centre in the past few days. They seized buildings on Gorky Street and are now advancing to the southwest of the city centre. Some pockets of Ukrainian resistance remain. Ukrainian soldiers have a major stronghold that has yet to be captured, but our troops are working to outflank and surround it. I think this stronghold will be seized soon, which will make it possible for our troops to exploit the success. So, with Chasiv Yar probably soon under Russian control, with Liman under Russian control, with Toretsk also under Russian control, with Konstantinovka in the low ground, again, an attack on Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, all of these places, looks very likely in the summer. And, well, it'll probably be prolonged and bitter, but sending supplies to these cities, given the geography for Ukraine, looks to me to be very difficult. And lastly, there is continuing Russian pressure in the south around Pokrovsk. And yesterday there were the first reports that the Russians have now broken in to the fortified village of Bogatyr in southwest Donbass. This was apparently hurriedly fortified by the Ukrainians as the Russians were gradually working to capture Kurakhovo. But it looks as if the Russians will probably be able to capture Bogatyr fairly soon, further opening the way for them to advance west, ultimately towards the Dnieper. So that is the military situation. We could see that a great battle for control of what's left of Donbass is shaping up, and it will probably start to play out from about maybe June, July, August. It will probably continue given the size of these places for several months, but it could be that the decisive battle of the war is going to happen there. And it's been said that if Donbass falls, there is really little to hold the Russians back from advancing further towards the Dnieper, towards the city of Zaporozhye, which would at that point perhaps become undefendable. Just saying. Anyway, there we go. That is the military situation as I see it. There's a lot of uncertainty. But going back to that Wall Street Journal article, when the Wall Street Journal says that the Russians not only have enough recruits every month to replace combat losses, but at the same time to build up these reserve armies, and that the equipment that they're providing, that their factories are producing, is not just enough to replace combat losses on the contact line, but also to build up these reserve armies as well. All that must also, it seems to me, call into question the entire narrative about Russian combat losses on the combat line. If it really were the case that the Russians were losing 1,000 men a day, or anything like that, dead or wounded, then Russian recruitment levels at 30,000, 30 to 40,000 a month would be just sufficient to make up the losses, not to build up huge reserve armies in the rear. I'm going to suggest that real Russian combat losses must be only a fraction of what is widely assumed in the West. Anyway, that's, I think, where we are on the battlefronts. Now, the Ukrainians are aware of all of this, and, well, their overall plan continues to be, of this I am sure, to try to find some way to drag the United States into the war. They didn't get the security guarantee with the investment fund, mineral rights extraction agreement, mineral deal, natural resources deal, could call it whatever you like. They weren't able to do that then. The coalition of the willing that Keir Starmer and Macron were talking about has basically vanished, as there isn't going to be a ceasefire. The idea of sending a reassurance force under cover of a ceasefire looks like it's dead. And to be frank, I don't think there's any prospect of NATO troops going into battle in Ukraine to fight the Russian army. So the Ukrainians, obviously they want ultimately to drag in the United States into a war. The fact that they've got an investment fund agreement much more favourable to themselves may provide them with certain encouragement. But in the meantime, Zelensky's priority, it seems to me, continues to be to bring the war to the Russians. Now, over the last couple of weeks, there's either been a slackening of Ukrainian drone attacks on Russia, or the Russians have found means to counter those drone attacks, either by destroying Ukrainian drone production factories, or by shooting down drones, or maybe Ukraine is struggling to make more drones. But anyway, whatever. But Zelensky and his people are now making increasing threats to attack the Red Square parade, or so it seems to me, on the 9th of May. I touched on this in my program yesterday, but this seems to be mostly what Zelensky is focusing on at the moment. And, well, I don't know whether there will be any attacks on the parade on the 9th of May. I think it would be an incredibly reckless and dangerous thing for Ukraine to do. But I suspect that we're going to see an intensification of Ukrainian operations, assassinations, and that kind of thing in the Russian rear over the course of the next few months. As whenever military pressure on Ukraine grows, the Ukrainians tend to respond by turning to do precisely this. Now, Vladimir Putin has just given an interview to his favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin, in which he has shown Zarubin round his apartment in the Kremlin. Now, Putin is the first Russian leader to live full-time, to live in the Kremlin, to have an apartment in the Kremlin since, since the 1960s. The last Soviet official to have a senior Soviet official to have an apartment in the Kremlin was the former Soviet president, head of state, Marshal Voroshilov, a political ally of Joseph Stalin. Stalin, of course, also had an apartment in the Kremlin, but none of the other Soviet leaders that came after him, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, any of the others, lived in the Kremlin. Putin told Zarubin that since the start of the special military operation, he, Putin, has been living mostly in the Kremlin. Now, that might be because the Kremlin is the center, the point where most of the command positions come together, and that it is easier for Putin to govern Russia and to keep control of the war from his command post in the Kremlin, as opposed to, say, his country residence at Novo-Ogaryovo, which Putin often likes to stay in. But I wonder whether there isn't another reason, which is that, of course, the Kremlin is much more defendable. Putin can be much more carefully protected by Russian security from assassination attempts in the Kremlin, with all its walls and its defenses. The Kremlin, after all, is a fortress, than he would be if he continued to work outside the Kremlin in Novo-Ogaryovo or in some other place. So there we are. We see that it seems to me that the Russian authorities take these assassination threats very, very seriously. And the steps that have been taken to protect Putin himself, the country's leader, reflect that fact. The fact that Putin, contrary to his earlier habits, is now living mostly in the Kremlin, by the way, also reflects the fact that he is now essentially a wartime leader. He is somebody who continues to be, in effect, at full time in what might be described as his command post. And no doubt he gets verbal reports from the General Staff every day, as previous Russian leaders who found themselves in wars also used to do. So anyway, it's an interesting fact. Putin, however, remains visible. He's just had a meeting with the American film director Oliver Stone, who I think he counts as a friend. He's attended the Znamie Society, which is a knowledge society, a public knowledge society that exists in Russia. He's made a speech there about the Second World War and Russia's and the Soviet Union's contribution to the victory and the importance of that victory for the Russian and Soviet people. So he is far from an invisible leader as far as the Russian people are concerned. And, well, there have been many pictures of rehearsals for the oncoming Red Square parade, and it looks as if tanks and armoured vehicles will once again be on display. It looks like, unlike what has been happening over the previous 2 years, this time we are likely to see a significant display of military power. And of course, other world leaders will be there. Xi Jinping from China will be there. Narendra Modi, very correctly, in my opinion, has made the decision to stay in India. The reason being the current conflict with Pakistan. Apparently, the Indians are currently in the process of undertaking what they call anti-terrorism raids into Pakistan to attack the group that they say was responsible for the recent outrage in Kashmir. But as I said, there is a very, very tense standoff with Pakistan at the moment. And I think Modi, absolutely rightly, has decided that in this kind of situation, his duty is to remain at home so that he's in full control and charge of the situation. He's the leader in place. He's not far away in Moscow watching a parade when, for all we know, all sorts of other things might begin to happen. So other world leaders, however, will be there. Xi Jinping, as I said, will be there. The leadership of Vietnam will be there. Lula of Brazil will be there. And with respect to the various sanctions threats that are still coming from the United States, the European Union, from Lindsey Graham, and from people like that, all of the talk, which I've been seeing, is the need for further development of the BRICS and of the importance of the BRICS for the importance of the BRICS and the new trading and economic system that the BRICS are creating for the future, obviously not just of Russia, but of China and all of the other BRICS countries as well. It's important to stress that as the major energy producer, the biggest producer of natural resources and raw materials within the BRICS, Russia plays an absolutely indispensable role in the BRICS. Without Russia, BRICS really cannot function. That is why, in some respects, we had the Ukraine war in the first place. People like Mr. Wes Mitchell understood that Russia is the key and that their idea was to break Russia, to force President Putin's fall, to take control of Russian foreign policy, to break the strategic partnership between China and Russia, and in effect to collapse the BRICS. So, given that the other countries are committed to preserving the BRICS, that all but guarantees that they will not support whatever sanctions the United States chooses to impose on Russia. Just to say. Now, the Chinese continue to insist that there are no negotiations underway between themselves and the United States on the tariff question. The Chinese, well, the public rhetoric from Beijing is that they remain confident that they can ride out the pressure, the tariff pressure that the United States has imposed on them through the tariffs. There's talk about a new economic plan to safeguard the ongoing development of the Chinese economy. And, well, there was an article by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, which I don't always agree with Martin Wolf. I usually disagree with him about most things. But he did make, I think, an entirely valid point, which is that the tariff war between the United States and China is a war in which China faces a crisis of demand, whereas the United States faces a crisis of supply, in that China provides many of the goods that the United States needs. So that is the supply to the United States, whereas the United States provides the demand for those goods, which is the demand that China does not have at the present time. But Martin Wolf also made the further point that in any contest of this kind, it is always easier, much easier by definition, to replace demand than it is to replace supply. in order to replace supply, especially as many of these goods that China exports to the United States are not being made elsewhere, or are not being made in the quantities to satisfy American demand. In order to fill those gaps in supply, the United States would have to build factories or find factories in other places around the world that would make those goods in order to satisfy the demand. And that factories obviously require supplies, they require elaborate supply chains, they require skilled workers, they require management, they require a whole funding infrastructure to be provided in order to make them function. And that is a long process, and one which usually, if it's to be done on a crash basis, would require a great deal of planning. Whereas demand can be provided much more quickly. And in China's case, China has an extremely high savings ratio. The Chinese population tends to put aside large, very large savings. And what the Chinese government needs to do in order to replace the lack of demand created by the tariff war by the United States is to find some means to get those savings released. And that is not perhaps actually such a complicated or difficult thing to do. I read a report by, I think, an Indian economist who actually looked into this and said that in fact China is well positioned to do this, that China over the last few years prioritized getting control of the property and housing asset bubble, that bubble has been burst, and that means that a stimulus action to increase demand is now easier for China to do than it might have been, say, 2 or 3 years ago, when that bubble was growing dangerously. And Xi Jinping's comment about a new economic plan to do that might be connected to this very thing. Well, we shall see. One thing I would say is that with China now tariffed and with the BRICS, as I said, working to create their own trading system, this whole idea of enforcing further sanctions against Russia seems so completely misconceived that it's difficult to understand why it continues to be discussed. There's been a report, I believe, by an Austrian institute that has made the further point that if we're looking at Russia itself, oil and gas revenues, energy revenues, have sharply reduced as their share of Russian budget revenues. It has gone completely unnoticed in the West that last year Russia carried out a significant tax reform, which, by the way, meant an increase in income taxes, which are now definitely increases in income taxes, which are now playing a significant role in supporting the budget. So the Russians are in a position to see out the sanctions. The BRICS states are likely to support them in doing so. The Europeans are not in a position to provide military support to Ukraine. The one thing that the events of the last couple of months have clearly exposed is that There's been a great deal said about European rearmament plans, but there's no real sign of those becoming effective in any sense. And, well, even as the Chinese and the Russians look resilient in the face of tariffs and sanctions, there's been the first indicator that the United States economy contracted in the first quarter of this year. A small contraction, but a contraction nonetheless. There are also reports, apparently there's reports that some American retailers have been warning the administration that they're facing shortages of goods in American shops. And, well, Europe is in an even worse condition. And for those who don't know, gas prices in Europe increased by around 30% this April, and are, I suspect, likely to go on increasing, given the general shortage of gas in the reserves in Europe, the gas reserves that underpin the functioning of the European economy. I'm going to say something. I think that the negotiations to achieve peace have probably conclusively failed. The last good opportunity to achieve peace in Ukraine was the one that took place over the last 3 months. It was botched. The Europeans never supported it. The Ukrainians were consistently hostile, and the Americans never thought it through. From this point on, I suspect it's going to be downhill. Downhill in military terms for Ukraine, downhill in economic and geopolitical terms for the United States, downhill in a massive way for Europe. I think that by the end of the year, we will not be just be in recession in Europe. We will be seeing major political and economic stresses as well. And, well, I have to say, I think downhill for the political fortunes of the 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump. Well, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.